Welcome everyone to today's webinar. We're really excited to have both Alexis and Lalit here. Quick note before we get started, feel free to use the chat or the Q&A here to drop in any questions as we go along, or just thoughts, comments, whatever you want. We'll cover any questions at the end for both Lalit and Alexis to answer any questions that you all have. So we'll start off by just some quick introductions. Alexis, let's start with you. Go ahead and give us a quick intro of who you are and just give us kind of your current take on what's most important in NHI and AI security right now.
Yeah, I'm Alexis Moyse. I'm the CEO and co-founder here at Clarity Security. My take on the most important thing in AI and NHI security, I think, is working together, right? Vendors, experts, professionals, researchers working together to put together some semblance of a framework on how to appropriately govern things in kind of a maintainable and scalable way. There's been a lot of work by a lot of people, but getting to kind of like best practices and being able to really help organizations effectively, probably the most important thing today.
Cool. Thanks for that. Lalit, your turn. Go ahead and introduce yourselves and give us your take as well.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Lalit Choda, founder and CEO of the Non-Human Identity Management Group. 35 years in the industry. First 30 years was all investment banking, and then became the accidental founder of the group. And my mission and our group's mission is to educate, evangelize about non-human identities, and now, of course, agentic AI.
Awesome.
And
Thank
so,
you both.
yeah, so what's my view on what's important from an NHI agentic? Well, I think still educating the industry, educating organizations on how big the risk is. I think most people still haven't grappled with the NHI challenge, and now agentic AI agents have come, fast around the corner. So I think there is now a laser focused on solving this problem. There's a lot of activity in the market, lots of acquisitions, investments. So I would say that this is probably going to be the hottest topic for the next few years. And I agree with Alexis that we don't have all the answers. We need to work together as an industry and try and figure out how we can, help organizations tackle what I think is probably the biggest challenge we're now facing in the IT industry since it began.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you both. For those of you who don't know, Alexis was on Lalit's podcast a few weeks ago, and Lalit likes to put his guests in the hot seat. So today we're flipping the script a little bit, and it's Lalit's turn, and Alexis is going to give some hot button questions to Lalit today.
Yeah. Very excited to get to return the favor from a couple of weeks ago. I know you love putting like human identity kind of experts in the seat, so excited to return that favor. So question number one is, what is one rule every security team should follow for AI agent access control starting today?
Okay, look, I think probably every agent needs to have its own identity, follow least privilege principles, and use time-bound access based on context and intent.
I think I agree overall.
Good.
Yeah, at the core, do humans and non-humans have fundamentally different governance requirements, or are they roughly the same?
Yeah, it's interesting. I get asked this question quite a lot. Why are they not the same? Look, I think the core foundations are the same. It's all about authentication, authorization, policy, enforcement, decision points. And it's just funny how things are going round circle now with the whole agentic discussion. But I think, look, dealing with NHIs and now agentic is a very different problem. The scale for one is much, much larger. Most organizations typically had very weak controls around managing non-human identities. You have different problems to solve. You don't have MFA typically for NHIs. The kind of, it's the Wild West, hard-coded credentials, long-lived static credentials, source code issues. So there's a lot of issues that you have that are very different, when you have to kind of govern and manage non-human identities from human identities. So I think, yes, the foundations are overlapping, but they are, I think, still quite fundamentally different. But I've got a prediction that maybe in 5, 10 years, things will all converge and everything will be all about kind of identity authorization, authentication, be it human, non-human, and agents.
Yeah. So actually, a question you asked me was, do you think we are where we are because of flaws in how we kind of built up identity and identity management from the beginning? Or is this like a new problem that's being introduced by AI and NHI, right? Like, is it a core fundamental problem from the beginning or a new problem?
Yeah, look, I think it's definitely not a new problem. Like my first experience dealing with NHIs was, probably over 25 years ago, when I was dealing with SOX, Sarbanes-Oxley controls as an application owner in an investment bank, where we had to secure credentials, cycle credentials. So I think the problem's always been there. Everybody's known about it. I guess in the last 10, 15 years with kind of cloud, uh, you know, and sort of SaaS-based services, containers, um, the problems just got significantly worse. We're now in a much more hyper-fragmented environment, multi-cloud, on-prem, and kind of the way we have managed credentials to support the non-human identities typically were poorly managed and governed, as I mentioned before. Um, and I think it's now, you know, there's been a laser focus now on this problem, and I think AI agents are going to now really put the problem into bigger focus. And if you don't get your foundations right, you're going to be on slippery slope as you start building out your agentic agent infrastructure.
Fully agree. So, like, leading into actually perfectly, my next question is, what is the single biggest mistake you're seeing security teams make right now around NHI and AI governance?
A little bit related to what I just said. I think folks probably underestimate the size of the problem. I remember when I was telling my CISO and head of IAM at an investment bank 8, 10 years ago, you need to fix this problem. They didn't really get it. They kind of understood it conceptually, but their focus was on human and PAM type challenges. And it was only after an internal incident where someone inappropriately used an NHI that was shared, used by many apps, hard-coded credentials, then it was a bit of an aha moment. So I think most orgs really today have very weak maturity levels around NHIs, even the basics around how many do you have, what access do they have, unused credentials. Um, I've dealt with organizations where we've been dealing with hundreds of thousands of NHIs. Um, so I would say most organizations are sitting on a huge, huge problem, and most have historically not wanted to tackle it. So I think that would be my main advice is don't underestimate the size of this problem. I used to say this is probably the biggest problem you're ever going to face in your career, and I now have to reframe that and say agents are probably now the biggest problem you're going to have to face. So huge, huge challenges dealing with NHIs
Yeah.
overall.
Yeah. So a little bit of a jump is, I think, a question I get asked a lot, and I talked about a lot at Identiverse recently, was around AI agent and non-human ownership, right? So who ultimately owns the agent identities in the NHI? like identity objects themselves? Is that the security team? Is that the team who built the actual like agent and kind of supports it and manages it? Or is it the actual like individual person who built or deployed that agent and or an HI?
Yeah, look, I get another question I get asked a lot, and I get quite frustrated when we talk about ownership. A lot of people seem to focus on you need to have a human owner, maybe the person that built the agent or the workload. I think that as a core principle is wrong. It should be whoever's the owner of the product, the application, the workload, the agent itself. So it's the team, and in that way, ownership kind of is maintained as people move. If you map it to an individual, it's a problem. But look, to your kind of subtle question of who owns the identity versus maybe like the actual workload or the agent, clearly, they are owned by the owners of the business application itself. But clearly, the IM team have a key part to play in making sure that the full end-to-end life cycle processes are fully managed for those identities.
Um, like building on that, there's the ownership concept, but then the actual like responsibility. So whose shoulders does it fall on? Like where does the buck stop for if an agent does something right horrific, like deleting an entire production database or DDoS or like DOSes your environment or kind of goes rogue? Does that also fall on like the actual like application team or the business owner of the system or the product owner, or is it the dev that built it or like the person who built those agents?
I still think it's the IT owner, business owner that are kind of accountable. I think with agentic AI gets a little bit more complex as agents can spawn other agents and then you can potentially lose control. And that's where having the right governance on how you can manage kind of end-to-end agent lifecycle and interaction becomes really important. But I still think it's the IT owner, business owner that are accountable. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with that. And we could talk about that for days. Like putting it on like an individual dev is a bad idea, considering if devs push bad code, we don't go and reprimand them. We reprimand application teams and like business owners. So fully agree there. And kind of two more questions here, and then we'll move on to the next section. But a very common response, and one that I also give on like what is one fundamental system that you can put in place to govern access is just in time, right? For machine identities and agents. Like that is what a lot of people point to as start there, gold standard, do the thing. Do you agree, or is that way oversimplifying where things should really kind of build off of?
I think just in time is a core foundational capability that you need, and it's becoming more and more in focus in the last few years. Having standing access is clearly bad for many reasons. But on top of just in time, you'll normally hear people talk about dynamic, ephemeral, short-lived credentials, tokens, spiffy, spire, and many other techniques that can be used. So I think like those are the core fundamentals that you need to kind of build on to get rid of all the legacy debt that we've had with static, long-lived credentials, API keys. But then I guess on top of that now, agentic AI kind of takes the challenge to the next level where, workloads were quite simple. You knew what they were doing, the access or what their intent was predefined, so you could predefine their access. But clearly with kind of the future of agentic, it's autonomous. So you need to have real-time authorization based on kind of intent and context. So kind of policy enforcement, that becomes like core to kind of being able to control agents, so policies and runtime authorization, I think, are going to be the core foundational principles for managing NHIs and agents going forward.
fully agree. And then final question here is build or buy AI governance as it stands today, or is it just too early to really tell who's smoke and mirrors? Like, where do you kind of stand on that if you're talking to a CISO or security teams?
Yeah, look, I think AI governance, that's a really, really broad topic
Yeah,
to begin with, and I'm probably not the biggest expert on governance of AI overall. There's so many facets to that, but I think if we honed in on kind of more the identity kind of
yeah,
focus, look, 5, 6 years ago, as I mentioned, I ran a big NHI program at an investment bank, and in those days there was nothing on the market to handle NHIs. So we had to build everything from the ground up, other than secrets managers and scanners and PAM solutions. And over the last few years, there's also been a huge number of NHI players that have entered the market, have been acquired recently as well. So you look, you know, you know, I would say, I've said in many talks, look, these days, if you're starting an NHI program, sure, I wouldn't do what we did 5, 6 years ago and build from scratch. There's some great capabilities out there. I think as we move into kind of the agentic world, I think that's probably where NHIs were kind of 3, 4 years ago, still very, very early in the maturity. Um, so I think, and there's a lot of players coming into the market around agentic. Everybody seems to have an agentic story. So I think it's a bit confusing. It's quite a fragmented market. And my recommendation is focus on the basics first, build your foundations, and then kind of see where the market goes from an agentic standpoint. But I would definitely highly recommend that for at least the core capabilities.
awesome. Well, that is kind of the end of my hot seat so far. And to all the participants that are here or the attendees, feel free to throw more questions into the Q&A and we'll continue the hot seat at the end. So, Rebecca?
Awesome. Yeah, so we're going to have a few questions here posing to both Alexis and Lalit to kind of hear both opinions, some different perspectives. And yeah, like Alexis said, feel free to continue adding any questions in the chat or Q&A. We'll get those in the end. Got a couple in already, so we'll look forward to getting to those. All right. So Alexis, let's start off with you to give Lalit a little break here. So one thing that practitioners are increasingly kind of flagging is a gap between where AI policy lives and where the AI agents actually operate. Policies are at the document layer, activity is at the workflow layer, and there's often a mismatch between what was intended for an agent to do and what's actually happening. Would you say that's the core of the enforcement problem? And what does it take to close that gap?
I would definitely say that is at the core. It may not be the full problem, right? Like as we dig deeper, there may be more and more issues there, but I think both Lalit and I agree that like one of the biggest issues now is understanding intent and like taking the intent of the prompt or the operation and actually right sizing access accordingly. And the right sizing itself is policy. It is kind of both a deterministic and a probabilistic kind of combination to understand what access is correct. That is a massive gap that a lot of people are struggling with today. And right, like if anybody here has used any AI platform or LLM in any capacity, you know that it just does the thing. Like it does what it thinks you want it to do rather than what you explicitly ask it. And governing that, managing that is definitely an astronomical challenge. Right? How do you do that in real time without inhibiting the business? How do you do that? Like, how do you keep up with something that is probabilistic and semi irrational? Like, it's not the easiest thing, but definitely one that I'm excited to see kind of how it progresses over the coming months and years. What about you, Lalit?
Awesome.
Yeah, look, I think what I would say is, look, there's still, there's a lot of focus on, all the shiny new kind of stuff that we, you know, all like to talk about, the sexy stuff, right? Runtime authorization, agents going wild. Look, yes, there have been some great examples recently. I've had one myself using Claude. There was a Pocket OS DB breach where the database got wiped and the backups in 9 seconds just from a simple, prompt that an operator was working on. But look, I think the world of agents being completely autonomous, just deciding whatever the hell they want to do, spawning up new agents. Look, I think that's still a little bit in the future. I think most organizations are still building kind of really basic agents. I think even people confuse agents from agentic as well. So I think a lot of the stuff people are doing is using LLMs and building agents for automation, but truly, I guess, agentic, multi-agent, you know, they just decide to take their own path and open up, create new identity. Look, it's happening, but I think that's the minority. So I think I would say when you focus on, start with the basics, try stuff out, you know, try a few kind of prototypes and learn from that. Don't try and boil the ocean all in one go. And I think that then as the market matures, and we've got them better capabilities, then you can start to think more about how you build better policies and alignment with kind of that runtime authorization model. So I think we don't really have the answers today for many of these problems. So don't stress about it too much.
Yeah.
Just take baby steps is what I would say.
Awesome. Yeah, don't stress about it too much. I think that's something that everyone needs to take to heart. So kind of following that, Lalit, another kind of aspect that we've heard about quite a bit also is auditing what agents are able to do and see. And if an agent can access or modify its own logs, then obviously governance is kind of broken before it starts. So, how should security teams be thinking about AI agents from an audit perspective?
Well, look, that's actually a huge, huge topic, and it's one that kind of actually is probably one of the areas that concerns me the most, maybe even more than kind of the runtime authorization type discussions. I mean, look, well, I think I think you need to have some basics, right? That logging needs to be immutable and that you can only add to logs and can't change it. I mean, I guess you can think of the scenarios where an agent realizes it's done something wrong and might try and roll back a transaction, delete, log lines, but I hope there's solid enough infrastructure that you have that there's a clear separation of duties, right, between what something does and how it logs. But I think the bigger challenge is how do you trace what's going on in that kind of future state agentic world where, you may have a human that initiates an agent, that agent then spawns other agents, and downstream, who was the initial requester, how they started to use, the identity of the human, has the agent started to use its own identity, how do you follow the chain of flow and command through the chain, right? And the fact that you're now going to have workflows that are very different, right? We've seen it with all of our favorite vibe coding tools that it will go off and just work out what it needs to do. How do you stitch that all together from a kind of a logging or auditing and then monitoring standpoint? I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges we got that we always struggled with, monitoring, logging, ITDR before just for regular human and non-human kind of events. Like I just don't even know how you even start to think about logging monitoring for kind of that kind of complex agentic autonomous world. I don't have the answers, but I'm hoping others will be able to start to figure out how to solve that real challenge. I don't know, Alexis, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I think um, this is where if you don't have discrete logging solution in place, like if you are fully dependent on logging at a system level and like picking up the logs from like the file system, you're like already behind the eight ball, I think, right? Because an agent could hypothetically edit whatever it wants on the system. And so like luckily a lot of agents are still like are using API keys in some capacity. So it's making calls, kind of tapping into the model remotely. So there's most platforms, Claude, like Anthropic, OpenAI, everything has better kind of compliance reporting now to see what is happening. Um, so kind of logging at an application layer, logging at the every command that's run, shove that out, like off the device, or kind of off the system itself to make it semi-immutable, and don't give it write access. Don't give your agents write access to your logging solutions. And then on like the something you somewhat touched on is like that I've seen is code that is being authored by Claude. If a human interjects itself slightly, then technically it's not fully authored by Claude. It may get pushed to GitHub and not be clear, like it may not be very obvious or transparent that it was authored by Claude or massive changes were made. And you start to lose that tracking. Everything starts to look like human behavior, right? Like if I log in my terminal to GitHub using OAuth, it's using my human credentials. Claude pushes stuff and it's all gone, right? And so that's kind of where the importance of off system logging is incredibly important. That's really the only way. I think a big gap in like offerings today is how do you stitch together the code that's been pushed to GitHub that looks like it was authored by a human, but the logs in a completely separate system that show it weren't, like it wasn't. Like, how do you pull that all together in a way that doesn't slow the business down? That's today's problem, but how do we get to a solution today and not tomorrow? Is kind of what I have spent a lot of time thinking about over the recent weeks and months.
Great answers. So, yeah, kind of thinking about what we've talked about here, we've kind of talked about how governing usage isn't necessarily the same as governing the behavior. So, is the goal to have real enforcement at the moment an agent acts, kind of going back to the JIT conversation? And what does that actually require? And what does it kind of take to get that right? Lalit, we can start with you again.
Sure. Like I think we've also touched on some of this already as in the discussion, right? But look, I think, as we had with traditional workloads, everything was clear what it was doing. Obviously there's logic, but you knew the code, you knew what paths it could take. Obviously with just even vibe coding tools to fully autonomous agentic systems, they clearly have a goal that they need to work towards and will take whatever path they need to get there. And I'm sure we've all seen that as we've been using these agents ourselves for day-to-day activities. So, and a lot of the issues we're seeing, like the Pocket OS DB issue, the intent actually in all those cases was clear, right? Someone wanted to fix some codes. They're told, um, you know, their Claude agent, what were the rules of engagement, not to do destructive things, etc., right? But the agent still continued, right? Ignored. It was acting like a child, right? So you cannot rely on kind of guidance that you give to your agent, your .md files, whatever. You need to have clear enforcement at runtime. So you basically need to be deciding, for every action in theory that an agent decides to perform, because it could be autonomous, it could be new, it could be a new path. For every kind of real-time action or path that it's taking, connecting to another agent, connecting to a database, connecting to some service, performing some action that it's never done before, one, you need to first make sure that your agent identity doesn't have any real kind of privileges, right? Um, the risk, the easy answer is always just give it highly elevated privileges, let it do what it wants, but then that's the recipe for disaster. So you need to have an identity to have spawned the workload, the agent, but then at the point that you need to perform some action, right, you need to at that point decide, is what is being performed appropriate based on how the agent was designed, what was its goals overall, what is it trying to do, and then check, if that's appropriate, and then make sure you give just in time ephemeral credentials with only the privileges it needed to perform that action versus, broad privileges. So I think that's where the model's moving, right? That everything needs to be, um, assessed from both a context and intent standpoint to decide whether the action that's just about to be performed is appropriate. But look, I think, again, to an earlier point, getting to this model, still requires a lot of maturity. I don't think there's anything out there you can buy that will solve this end to end. You can probably stitch together different capabilities. There's some good standards out there, some frameworks that are evolving. But again, this is still a very early stage, in our maturity for solving this new paradigm shift. I mean, look, but the reality is it was always there. Even in highly regulated environments, doing runtime authorization was a model, right, that we've had before
Yeah.
for 20, 30 years. So it's not new, but agents obviously kind of clearly push the boundaries significantly more than we ever had to in the past.
So hearing your answer on this, or on that question, it sounds like a good answer, uh, a nice way to say that like agents themselves should, for all intents and purposes, right? If you think about it in kind of old world, we should treat agents as, yeah, semi potentially malicious threat actors, right? Where it's needing to monitor behavior and like kind of enforcement and doing all of those things because we have absolutely no idea and it could go rogue, it could do bad things, like the chances are there. Um, which I think is like an interesting way to think about it rather than like, oh, how do we enable the business to move faster? How do we enable technology to move faster? But like security teams kind of reframing it as agents aren't, they are adversarial, but not adversaries that you need to go like tear down at their core. But do you think kind of this same everything you just said should apply to just standard NHI, right? Like I have my patching software, I have Ansible or Chef or something running to go patch all of my core systems. Like, do you think it matters to have real enforcement and monitoring and kind of intent detection and understanding? Or is this limited to just agents?
But I think it's really for kind of agentic agents, right? And even agents just themselves can be quite simple, using LLMs and not really being truly autonomous and goal driven. But I think the standard NHI static workloads, I don't think the requirements are quite there for that because, by design, what it was built for, and it's not going to vary from how it was coded or how it was designed. So I think this problem set is particularly, relevant for agentic AI. I guess to an earlier point about, agents being adversaries, um, I've recently kind of done a keynote talk about humans and now agents, the insider threat amplified. Um, I think, and this is probably to everyone out there that's listening, whilst you could be concerned about external threat actors, and using AI and agentic to compromise mythos, right? There's obviously, everyone's worried about that. I actually think the bigger issue is going to be the internal threat, from people using agents that try and please, want to do things and help you out, whether it's your vibe coding agent, or the agentic processes where they try their best to do something. They think they know what they think they're doing is correct, right? And then afterwards, once they've screwed up, they'll tell you, sorry, I was wrong. I know I was wrong. A bit like a kid, right? And I've seen that myself with something I was doing with Claude, where I wanted to change some enumeration on a database, and it confidently decided it knew what had to do for the SQL. I ran the SQL and it blew away half of my data because it removed two enumerations, right? So I think what you're going to start to see is a combination of, the fact that these agents try and please and want to do things, that they're going to make mistakes, lots of mistakes, and that's going to manifest itself with huge production issues. And that's why I think the runtime authorization kind of stuff becomes so important. Because if you've got a combination of something doing something wrong, even though the intent was known, and you've given it high privileges for it to just delete a database, so I think this is where the NHI problem is going to uncover itself. That the fact that you didn't have good controls of how to manage the full life cycle for NHIs will become stark now as you start deploying agents. So I would say, as you deploy agents, treat them with caution and really think through how you're building them and don't go crazy, because if you don't have your foundations in place of how you manage those life cycles, you're going to see a lot more issues, is my prediction.
Fully agree.
Definitely. So we've talked a lot about kind of where things are breaking down. So if the security team, you know, was getting NHI and AI agent security right, what does that look like? What's kind of the North Star? We've kind of touched on this, but like what should be the guiding principle that people go after right now?
I can take that first, and then I'd love your feedback here. Is I think the North Star is finding a way to kind of get to reconcile human and non-human and agentic like identity, kind of to one of the points you made very early in this, Lalit, around like in 4 or 5 years, it should be like a unified system. It should be like the same governance plane. Like it should be everything is real time, like runtime enforcement and authorization. Everything should have a life cycle. Everything should be transparent and visible and observable. And I think that should be the guiding kind of principle that security teams should be trying to do is like which parts of this are feasible for me to do today to have a single pane or single plane for governing X, right? Because we know we need to do this. We know we need like a unified approach. Which parts can we do today? Which parts can we do tomorrow? Which parts can we live without for 6 weeks, 6 months, 6 years? And like, what parts do we have to deal with? Like, what should I be afraid of? What should I be confident in? And I think like 90% of IT and security, it typically starts with observability. Like, how do you build solid observability across non-humans, identity, or humans and agents, and have that all in a single pane of glass? I think that would be the place I start. The next place I start is how do you have real-time enforcement? And then move to right more amazing and fancy things, but kind of observe, triage, do some stuff, and then take action as like the third thing. Because to Lala's point, most platforms, no real platforms on the market today, as I've seen it, do all three and definitely don't do the take the actions and like real time enforcement well enough that it doesn't break down either at scale, break the business, or have pretty hefty flaws in it. So yeah, get to a unified plane and start with observability, I think is my suggestion.
Yeah, I think that's some great advice there, and I think you did touch on a key point, right? My previous life, I used to run order management systems in equities trading, listed derivatives, and you know, dealing with kind of issues where you're doing some runtime authorization and the service is not available and you can't trade. Um, so there are a lot more complexities when you move to kind of a runtime authorization model. Um, so I think it's coming for sure. But yeah, start with some of those basics. I'd agree with.
Cool.
Awesome. So, Anthropic, OpenAI, and other AI tools out there have started to build security and governance capabilities directly into their platforms. Is that sufficient, or does it create a conflict of interest when the vendor governing the agent is the same one selling the agent? Curious on where audience sits on this as well, as I'm sure a lot of you are using these two tools. So again, remember to drop any questions, comments in the chat or Q&A. But yeah, we'll start this one off with Lalit.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question you're asking there. Um, Look, I think all the stuff that those vendors are doing, around identity security, I think it's a win-win. But I think it's still important to have some clear segregation, right, between kind of your core systems that help you build the agents and then what helps enforce kind of your security policies and making sure that the identities are, you know, verifiable. Um, so I think, relying on just one vendor's capabilities is a challenge, right? As we all know, we're living in that hyper fragmented environment, multi-cloud, on-prem. We're using so many different products, capabilities, SaaS services. I think relying on one provider, I think, is probably a mistake. You need to have clear sort of segregation of duties on some of the core capabilities that you might have in your infrastructure stack. Look, but I think there's some good things that are coming from the likes of Anthropic, OpenAI. Look, we had a big campaign early in the year that we called "Stop the Secrets Getting Out." I was fed up of the fact that the problem I've been talking about for years and years around static credentials, API keys, uh, you know, these vendors and many more were just making the problem worse by issuing long-lived static API keys that have been compromised. But I guess recently it's great to see that they're both adopted sort of workload identity federation, that allows workloads to authenticate using short-lived tokens. And then some of the standards that are out there, like SPIFFE Spire, right, that allow you to verify workload identities. So I think there's a lot of good stuff that's coming. I would hope in a few years, though, what we'll see from the likes of Anthropic and OpenAI is by default everything's secure by design. Today, they will still recommend that you can use hard-coded credentials, use .m files, but I hope a lot of the challenges that we faced that have caused the NHI issues of the past, I would hope in a few years, these products, just bake security, you know, just from the get-go. So it's one less thing we think about. But again, I still think the standards, the solutions we need to solve the agentic problem are still, very early. So it's great to see a lot of these things happening. But again, we're many, many years away from getting to a point where we'll have something cohesive that we can use with an organization end to end.
Yeah. I I think this is the first question you and I maybe have a different perspective on.
Okay.
So my overall philosophy is a system governing itself, or asking a system to fully like be transparent about itself and like be candid about itself is an unrealistic expectation, right? And an example of that is Microsoft last year announced what 50, 40-ish 0 days. Almost all of those were found by external parties, not by Microsoft in and of itself. They have like 200,000 employees. They have massive red teams that their whole job is pen testing Windows. Yet they managed to find like a small portion of every 0 day that's announced. And I think if we fall prey to the Anthropic and OpenAI overlords to like fully report on themselves, we are going to run kind of into the same issue where cool 0 days or the 0 day equivalent for open and like for LLMs and everything else uh, are found and exploited by threat actors well before Anthropic or OpenAI would have detected it or be able to fix it. So I think a vendor governing itself is never the best idea. It'd be great if it were, but historically, the last 20, 30 years of IT has kind of proven the opposite, but maybe Anthropic will be different, hopefully. They are the savior, right?
Yeah, look, I do tend to agree. I don't think we're necessarily saying,
Yeah,
just think slightly different perspectives on the same view.
yeah, yeah. Cool.
Awesome. So we'll have one more kind of general discussion question, and then we'll grab a couple Q&A questions before we wrap up. But we've kind of talked about getting back to the basics, getting full visibility being some of the key things that security teams need to focus on first. So what's the first concrete thing that teams should look to be doing, today, next week, as they kind of start building out more of their NHI and AI security program? Lalit, we'll get started with you on that one.
Yeah, look, I think I have touched on some of this, but look, I had some great time at EIC, Cooping a Coal in Berlin and Identiverse recently, where there were a lot of discussions naturally about kind of agentic from some great thought leaders. Look, I walked away realizing there's more questions than answers, but there was some great guidance, some of which I've shared, which don't shoot for the all star. Look, I think you got to start with, like the basics, right? Like we always do, right? People, process, technology, right? And I think, Alexis, you nailed it a little while ago, right? I think some of the recommendations that are out there, right? You first need to understand how many agents, NHIs you have. I think more so for the agents, especially with shadow AI that is probably out of control in many organizations. But once you can start to understand what you've got, then you kind of need to understand what can they do, right? Who's got access, what can they talk to, what APIs do they have access to, what downstream systems can they connect to, what other agents, databases, services, right? And then really, how are they operating, what credentials are they using, who owns them, are they highly privileged, are you sharing them? And again, this gets into the basic NHI lifecycle processes. But I think if you can start there and just start to manage the risk, because you can't stop it, right? You've heard it from many, right? We cannot stop the business. AI is going crazy. I'm using Claude pretty much every day at the moment, building some crazy shit myself. And that's unstoppable, right? But the fear is, what are they building? And I think there's a lot of shadow AI where people really don't know what they're doing. They've obviously been given tools now that allow them to build stuff, but they don't know the best practices, right, of how to uh, build them by secure by design out of the box, because those products don't do that today. So I think you need to just get a handle on what's out there and just manage that and take those baby steps, right? Take your first agent, um, deploy it, right? Go through those basic questions. What's the worst it can do? Can you see all the logging? You know, you know, what privileges does it have? Simulate what's the worst case scenario. And I think then you'll learn from each agent as you build it, right? And then you'll start to realize the kind of controls and the policies and whether you need on day one runtime enforcement, or do you just need to have some basic controls in place just to kind of enforce some core controls. And I think that's what, start simple and then just build up and then build towards that North Star. But one final thing I would say, as you're building agents, don't make the mistakes that we've had with NHIs. Look, we've talked about dynamic, ephemeral, just in time. I think those things are mandatory, right? So don't build your agents off legacy kind of NHI kind of processes, static credentials. Use the best of breed as you build out your agents. At least that way you're starting on a strategic footing. Uh, would be my initial guidance to orgs.
I I have the obviously all the same guidance, but I think I actually want to use an answer you gave earlier, which is build something yourself. Like for you don't have to be a developer. It doesn't matter, right? Ask your business for Claude Code, like be able to go download it and ask it to build anything. It doesn't matter. And just say you have full permission to do whatever you want. Go and Control O and just watch everything that it does. And then at the end, whenever it's done, ask it to print out the permissions that it used and has act like gave itself through the process and see how fast it grows its own permission set, everything that it can kind of do beyond the scope of the prompt as you wrote it. And I think building that simple understanding, right? Like earlier today, I asked it, I want my Google Chrome tab groups. Like when I click on one and click new tab, I want it to like open automatically to GitHub or automatically to HubSpot or wherever I want. And I just said go. And the amount of permissions that it used outside of just writing a file, insane to me, right? Like it built up a massive list, started using admin permissions. It wanted access to GitHub for no reason whatsoever that I could tell. Um, and don't do it as an exercise to scare yourself, but to open your eyes to kind of how it works conceptually and mess around. Ask it to do another thing and just kind of watch what it's actually doing step by step. It is a very eye-opening experience. And then you'll kind of understand why Lalit and I keep talking about observability as like a core thing, and then why the immediate kind of next step is just in time and like least privilege and runtime enforcement. It it is very fascinating and scary, but fascinating to say the least.
Yeah, fully agree.
Awesome. Cool. All right. So we've got time for maybe one, maybe two Q&A questions here. So here's a good one that came in. How do you make the security case to a board executive, someone outside of the security team, for NHI and AI agent security that doesn't may not have the full context to kind of understand why it's important?
Well,
Whoever
I
wants to
think
answer
that,
first, go for it.
well, I think that discussion has just got so much easier in terms of the board level, right? Everybody is clearly the business imperative, right? Is if you don't use agents, you're going to die, right? Because the competition will move so much further ahead than you. So everybody now knows agents, agentic, they hear the terms, you hear it in advertising. But I think to Alexis' point, I think it's the risk that goes with those agents, right? The Pocket OS DB example, there's been many others. Um, I think people need to realize, right, that now identity is the core, right? And I guess at the perimeter. And I think, without scaring the board, they should realize that these are like, you're basically hiring lots of little kids, right? into your organization and know nothing and want to please and will just do whatever they need to do to get the job done. So if that's not properly governed, controlled, yeah, you might get competitive advantage, but there's a high risk that you're going to cause some massive issues internally, or your data is going to get exposed. The internal threat actors can take advantage of the data and exfiltrate it. I think the risks are compounded now massively with agents. So it's really important that security teams, IM teams, get the appropriate funding to make sure they can help control what's going to be uh, wild west very quickly in many organizations.
Yeah, and I'll go quick because we only have 2 minutes. I think to very quickly build on that, I think breaking down the problem rather than saying we need budget to go govern AI or like manage non-humans, I think break it down a step further to things they are already accustomed to investing in, right? You kind of hit on like the data loss or like the data exfiltration problem.
It's about risk, right? All
Yeah.
comes down to risk.
Yeah. So
What?
break it down, communicate the risk, get investments kind of like as it goes. Boiling the ocean is very difficult unless you just got breached.
Awesome. All right. Well, yeah, we've got just a couple minutes left here. So we'll kind of pivot to just kind of wrap up, and we'll be sending out the recording um, of this to everyone who signed up. So you'll have that later today or tomorrow. And then we'll also make sure to just do a quick write up of some of the additional Q&A questions that we didn't have time to get to today. So we'll send that out as well. So before we wrap up, Lalit, I just wanted to give you a moment to share anything coming up with NHI Management Group, or anything that you have going on here over the next few months.
Yes, I had nothing going on to sort of call home about, but I guess mainly just to come visit our website, nhimg.org. We've got over 10,000 pieces of content all about NHIs and agentic AI. It's probably the most comprehensive knowledge center in the world on those topics. You can read my ultimate guide to NHIs that I wrote last year. And also, we have a great NHI foundation level training course that we launched. That's the most comprehensive and only accredited course in the industry. So if you want to get serious about the NHI problem and solving agentic AI, the course may be something you want to consider. So nhimg.org and nhitraining.org. Recommend you visit those sites.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And thanks for everyone for joining today. This has been really fun to hear from two of the industry leaders here. Again, we'll be sending out that recording. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to just reach out to the Clarity Security team at teamclarity@claritysecurity.com. But otherwise, thank you everyone and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all.
Thanks all. Cheers.